I hadn't spoken in 43 hours, not a word, not even to myself, not even in the mirror. Because sometimes silence becomes safer than truth, and when you've been quiet long enough, the idea of using your voice feels like trying to breathe. Underwater, and that morning gray sky, breath fogging the window pane. Coffee gone cold beside untouched toast, Ty stared at my phone and debated deleting your contact. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. And that kind of caring had always come with consequences. And right as I hovered over your name, thumb trembling, it lit up with a message I hadn't asked for, but needed more than food, more than sleep, more than oxygen, and all it said was, "You don't have to say it. I hear you anyway," and I broke, not loudly, not with sobs or shattered things, but quietly. Like something inside me had finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. And that was how it began, not with a confession, not with a plan, but with someone choosing to stay before I proved I was worth staying for. And I didn't respond. Couldn't, because words felt too sharp for the moment, too stiff and deliberate. But I got in my car and drove to the bench where we always used to meet, the one beneath the sycamore that shed pieces of gold in October like it believed in softness more than permanence. And you were already there, thermos in hand, scarf wrapped twice. Eyes scanning the street like you'd been there for hours, or maybe forever. And when you saw me, you didn't smile, not right away. You just nodded, like you understood I wasn't ready to be okay yet. And I sat beside you without a word, and you poured me coffee like it was the most normal thing in the world. Like we were still the kind of friends who could sit for whole afternoons without naming the ache between us. And maybe we were, or maybe we had become something quieter. Something truer, because I don't remember what we said that I don't even know if we spoke, but I remember the weight of your shoulder against mine, and the way my body stopped trembling for the first time in days. And that night when I got home, I opened the voice memo app and recorded a single breath. Not a sentence, not a poem, just a breath, just proof that I existed, and I named the file Day 1. And I kept recording one breath every night after that, and every time I almost gave up. Almost disappeared back into the numbness, you'd message me some strange small thing this sky made me think of you. Or I saved you the last spoonful of soup and I'd remember what it felt like to be known in silence. And slowly I started answering, not with words but with photos. With blurry images of my window at 2 a.m. or the soft corner of a book I couldn't finish. And somehow that became our language, a way to say, I'm not okay, but I'm not gone, and you never rushed me. Never demanded the full story, never asked for the why behind the tremors. You just kept showing up like presence was enough, and maybe it was. Because even though the hurt sat in my chest like a second heartbeat, it started to feel less sharp. When I was near you, like your quiet, heard the parts of me I didn't know how to translate. And I don't know the exact day it happened. But eventually I opened my mouth and said your name, soft and cracked and barely audible. But your eyes lit up like it was the most beautiful sound you'd ever heard. And I realized then that maybe friendship wasn't about fixing each other. Maybe it was just about staying long enough for someone to feel safe being broken in front. Of you, it was the way you didn't flinch when I fell apart that changed everything. The way you let the silence stretch long enough for it to feel like a kindness instead of a failure. And I remember sitting in your living room with my hands folded too tightly in my lap, trying to hold myself together by force. And you were across from me, curled up in that worn gray armchair like the quiet had never once made you uncomfortable. And I kept thinking, say something, anything, make this easier, but you didn't. And somehow that made it easier anyway, because there's a kind of healing that happens when someone chooses to listen without waiting for their turn to speak. And that night, you offered me a blanket without asking if I was cold, like you knew my shivering wasn't about the weather. And when you brought out a notebook and placed it on the table between us, you didn't ask me to write in it, just said, Sometimes it helps, and walked away. And I stared at the cover like it held something dangerous, like maybe putting thoughts down would make them real. But later, when the house was still and the clock ticked loud against the dark, I opened it and wrote. I don't know what hurts more, the memories or the way they come without warning. And I tore the page out and left it on the table for you to find in the morning. And when I woke up, there was a post-it stuck beside it that read, "Both are valid." And it was the first time in years I didn't feel crazy for feeling too much. The first time someone named my chaos without shrinking from it. And over the next few weeks, we created this rhythm, not of healing exactly, but of surviving with softness, of small gestures and invisible threads. And every time I left your house, I found I could breathe a little easier, like my ribs had stopped caving in. And one night you handed me a small envelope and said, "No pressure." And inside was a playlist titled "For When You Don't Want to Talk," and it made me cry, not because of the songs, though they were beautiful, but because you made space for my silence without making it feel like absence. And I played those songs on loop for days, letting the melodies say all the things I couldn't. And slowly I began to speak again, in fragments at first, words slipping out like cautious birds, landing on coffee cups and lamplight and shared walks. And you caught each one without clinging, just nodded or smiled or sometimes looked away to give me room to breathe. And that mattered more than you'll ever know, because I had spent so long being interrupted, so long having to explain myself to people who only heard the volume, never the meaning. And here you were, letting my voice arrive unpolished, uncertain, and real. And there was one night I'll never forget when I told you about the moment I stopped trusting people. The way a room went still, the way a voice turned from warmth to thunder. And I said it all in one breath, shaking and tired and waiting for you to look at me differently. But you didn't. You just reached out slowly and said, "That shouldn't have happened to you." And those words, as simple as they were, felt like someone had finally handed me back the piece of myself I lost that day. And I didn't even realize I was crying until you passed me a napkin without looking away. And later that night, as we sat on the floor with a blanket over our legs and our backs against the couch, you told me something too. Not because you owed me vulnerability, but because you trusted me with it. And I realized then that maybe this was what healing looked like, not fixing, not forgetting, but holding the ache together in a way that didn't make it heavier, just less lonely. The thing no one tells you about healing is how often it feels like grief, how remembering joy can ache just as much as remembering pain. Because once you start to feel again, everything comes back in full color, the good, the cruel, the almost sand. That week, I couldn't stop thinking about a night from years ago. A small room, a cracked ceiling, and the version of me who once whispered apologies into her pillow for simply wanting to be seen. And I told you this without warning halfway through a cup of tea that had already gone cold. And you didn't ask for more details, just said, "I used to apologize to my reflection too." And suddenly, it didn't feel like confession. It felt like communion, like two people naming the weight they once carried in silence and deciding together to put it down. And after that, I stopped editing myself around you, stopped counting the number of times I said "I'm sorry" and started saying what I actually meant. And you noticed, gently, always gently, pointing out the moments I let truth spill instead of retreat. And one night, while we were sorting through old boxes in your attic, you handed me a photo of us from years ago, back before everything cracked. And I stared at it for a long time, not because I missed that version of us, but because I finally understood why we had to fall apart before we could rebuild something real. And I told you that, haltingly, unsure how it would land, but you just smiled and said, "Some things only grow back softer." And I wrote that down the second I got home, taped it to my mirror, and read it every morning like it was scripture, like it gave me permission to keep becoming. And slowly my world began to shift, not dramatically, but in small, steady ways, like how I started going outside before the sun fully rose, just to stand in the quiet and feel what it meant to be alive without urgency, or how I started writing. Again, not for an audience, not for approval, but for myself. For the version of me who still lived in the margins of notebooks and the spaces between heartbeats. And I let you read those pieces sometimes when I was brave enough, and you always read them slowly, reverently, like the words mattered even if they were messy. And that gave me courage not just to keep writing, but to keep speaking, because somewhere along the way I stopped flinching when I heard my own voice, stopped wondering if I was too much or too quiet or too broken to be worth loving. And one afternoon, when we were walking through the woods just outside town, you turned to me suddenly and said, "Do you realize how far you've come?" And I stopped mid-step, leaves crunching beneath my boots, and for the first time, I did. I really did. Not in the way people say it to convince themselves, but in the way that feels like standing still inside your own progress. And I think that was the moment I stopped waiting for someone to hand me permission to be whole, because your friendship had already shown me I didn't need to earn it. And from that day on, I let myself believe I could have peace without apology, love without transaction, and a life that wasn't just about survival. And I knew that no matter what came next, I'd never again be someone who mistook silence for safety. Because now I knew what it meant for someone to hear the hurt I never said out loud and stay anyway. Some days I still woke up with the weight before the light, with dreams that left their fingerprints on my chest like smoke that refused to clear. And I never said much about them because pain that lives in the body often loses shape when you try to explain it. But you always seemed to know, always seemed to move a little slower on the mornings when I blinked too long at my coffee or forgot what day it was. And you never made it feel like weakness, only whether something to be carried together. And there was something sacred in that. In the way your presence didn't demand a performance, in the way you stayed steady when I was unsure of everything else. And I think it was a Tuesday when I realized I wasn't bracing for the next breaking anymore. Wasn't flinching at doorways or holding my breath when I entered rooms that used to echo with absence. And that morning you played a song I hadn't heard since before everything fell apart. And I didn't run from it, didn't turn it off. Just sat there and let the notes wrap around the parts of me that still remembered how to tremble. And I looked at you and said, "Thank you for not making me explain everything." And you smiled like it wasn't the first time I'd said that, but maybe the first time I believed it. And that night we walked through the neighborhood just after the rain. And the world smelled like clean beginnings, and you told me about a book you were reading, something about how grief isn't linear, how healing often feels like losing the same thing in softer ways. And I laughed, that kind of tired, holy laugh that comes not from joy, but from recognition. And I said, "That's exactly it." And you just nodded like maybe you knew it would land that way. Like maybe you shared it for me more than for you. And in that moment, I wanted to ask you how you knew so much without being told. How you kept showing up in the right places without a map. But I didn't, because some questions are answered by presence, not explanation. And instead, I said, "Let's keep walking." And we did, past the streetlights and the windows lit from within, past the memory of who I used to be and the shadow of who I thought I had to become. And we didn't talk much after that, just existed beside each other. And I realized that silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of every word I never had to say, every ache you understood without needing the story. And that was when I knew, really knew, that love didn't always come in declarations or vows or grand gestures. Sometimes it came in the way someone memorized your silences and still chose to stay. And I wanted to tell you that, wanted to say, you saved my life without ever trying to. but all I managed was a soft, "You're good at this." And you looked at me, puzzled and warm, and said, "At what?" And I shrugged and whispered, "At holding things without breaking them." And you looked away like that meant more than you were ready to admit. And I didn't press, didn't need to, because the truth had already settled between us like light. On water, still and wide and enough. I didn't mean to tell you that night. Not everything. Not the version of the story I kept locked beneath 7 layers of quieter, more acceptable truths, but something in the way you sat there. In the way your eyes didn't ask, but your stillness made room, made the words rise up like a tide that had waited too long. And I remember sitting on your floor, cross-legged and shaking, tracing patterns into the rug just to keep my hands busy. And when I said, I think I was more scared of being believed than being ignored, you didn't look away, didn't interrupt, didn't reach for a solution. You just said, "I get that." And I broke a little nod because it hurt, but because it didn't, not like I thought it would. Not like the last time I opened that part of me and was met with silence that screamed louder than any rejection. And I kept talking, not all at once, not in any order that made sense, but piece by fragile piece. And you caught every one without squeezing too tight, like you knew this wasn't about fixing. It was about witnessing. And by the time I finished, or at least paused long enough to breathe, your eyes were wet too, and I thought you might say something big, or comforting, or profound. But you didn't. You just reached over and placed your hand on mine, and somehow that meant more than anything you could have said. And the rest of the night passed quietly, the kind of quiet that feels full, like the space after a song ends, but the echo still holds you. And I didn't sleep much after that, but for once, it was the photo album that did it. The old one tucked behind your bookshelf like a secret you hadn't decided whether to keep or forget. And I only found it because I dropped my notebook and it slid across the floor to a place I hadn't noticed before, and when I pulled it out, dust clinging to the corners like memory, you froze for a second. Eyes soft with that look you get when the past pulls louder than the present. And I asked if I could open it, already knowing the answer, but still needing to ask. And you nodded without speaking. So I sat there with it in my lap, flipping through images of younger versions of you, younger versions of everything. And I could see it in the pictures, the way your smile shifted over the years from unguarded to half-held. The way your eyes became more careful, more practiced. And I didn't say anything at first. Didn't ask what happened between page 4 and 5, between the picnic and the hospital wristband, because some questions aren't questions at all. Just open doors, and when you finally spoke, it was slow and uneven, like the words had waited a long time to be released. And you told me things you hadn't told anyone, things that made me wish I could go back in time and stand beside you, when no one else did, and I didn't interrupt, didn't react, just listened. Because I finally understood how much it takes to hand someone the map of your pain and trust they won't get lost in it or walk away. And when you were done, I didn't say, "I'm sorry," even though I was, even though it ached in my chest, like a second heartbeat, because I knew that wasn't what you needed. So instead, I whispered, "I see you." And you looked at me with this quiet astonishment, like no one had ever said those words in a way that felt like they meant it. And I thought about how strange it is that two people can sit across from each other for years and never really be seen. And then one day, 1 hour, one breath changes everything. And from that point forward, I started seeing you differently, not in a way that made you small or broken, but in a way that made you real, layered, whole. And it made me realize how often we live as fragments, hiding our sharpest edges in the hope that someone might still love the smoother parts. But you didn't ask me to file anything down, and I didn't ask that of you either, and maybe that's why it works. Maybe that's why this space between us feels more like a sanctuary than a conversation. And that night, we lit candles not for any reason. Not for mood or atmosphere, but because something in both of us needed softness that flickered, needed warmth that wasn't coming from our words. And we sat there in the gentle glow and said nothing for a long time, just breathed. And I think we both knew we were standing in the middle of something we couldn't name yet. Something that had grown from the hurt we never spoke aloud. And it wasn't perfect, wasn't tidy or cinematic. But it was real, and that meant more than anything else ever could. Because in a world that asks us to package our pain for easy digestion, we found a way to share it without performance. And every time you looked at me and didn't ask for more than I could give, I healed a little more, not in a way anyone else could see, but in the quiet, slow way that starts with breath and becomes belief. And when I finally stood to go home, you hugged me not hard, not tight, just enough, and said, "You're doing better than you think." And I didn't cry, not then. But when I closed my door that night and sat down in the stillness of my room, I whispered it back to myself like a prayer. Like a truth I was just beginning to believe. There was a part of me that didn't trust the peace, not because it felt false, but because I'd never known peace that didn't leave eventually. And I remember telling you that in the quietest way possible, not in a full sentence, just in pieces, pauses between sips of tea, glances that lingered too long on the floor, shoulders that stayed slightly tensed, even in your softest space, says, and you heard it. Not because I said it clearly, but because you were always listening to the things I couldn't name. And that afternoon, instead of trying to convince me that everything was fine, you simply said, "It's okay to doubt the good when all you've known is the leaving." And I looked at you like you'd just given a name to something that had been living in my throat for years. Something I had swallowed so many times it had become part of me. And you didn't press after that, didn't try to fix it, didn't flood me with reassurance or wrap it in bright words. You just stayed, and in staying, you showed me that love doesn't always need to be loud to be real. And I think that's when I started to believe that this, whatever we were building, might be stronger than the ghosts I kept waiting to return. And there was one night in particular I still think about, when we sat on the floor with mismatched blankets and watched some old film neither of us paid attention to. And halfway through, you said, "You don't have to keep bracing for the hurt." And I almost laughed because I didn't realize I was. Didn't realize how much of my body was still a map of past wounds I kept expecting to reopen. And you must have seen that flicker in my eyes, because you added, "I'm not going anywhere." And I didn't say anything back. But I believed you, maybe not fully, maybe not forever. But for that moment, sometimes one moment of belief is all it takes to plant something new inside the wreckage. And in the days that followed, I started noticing little things about Kisu's, about myself that felt different, things I hadn't paid attention to before, like how I walked taller when I left your house, or how I stopped checking my phone with dread every morning, or how I laughed without apology when something actually made me feel light. And it wasn't that the sadness was gone, it never really is, but it had softened somehow, become something I could carry without it drowning me. And a lot of that was you. Not because you took it away, but because you never asked me to carry it alone. And that kind of companionship is rare, the kind that doesn't demand explanation or repayment, the kind that sees the worst parts of you and chooses you anyway. And I remember once asking you why you stayed, why you kept showing up. Even on the days when I gave you nothing but silence and distance and fractured half-thoughts, and you just shrugged and said, "Because I'd want someone to do the same for me." And I don't know why that answer broke me, but it did. Maybe because it wasn't dressed up in poetry or wrapped in some grand emotional philosophy. Maybe because it was simple and honest and human. And that's what you always gave me: honesty, humanity, space, and, in return, I found myself offering parts of me I never thought I'd trust to anyone again. Not out of obligation, but because you made it safe too. And sometimes I think back to who I was before all this, before you. And I can barely recognize that person, not because I've changed so drastically, but because I've started to return to who I was before the world asked me to disappear. And that's the quiet miracle of this friendship. This steady, wordless devotion that made me believe, piece by careful piece, that maybe I was never too broken to be known. Maybe I was just waiting for someone who would hear the hurt I never said out loud and stay anyway. The moment that changed everything wasn't loud or dramatic or wrapped in some kind of confession. It was small, almost forgettable. It's a kind of moment you only recognize in hindsight when your chest aches a little because you realize how safe you felt for a second without even knowing it. And for me, it happened in the middle of a Tuesday when I hadn't planned to see you. When I'd been curled under my blankets with every intention of avoiding the world. But you texted without pressure, just a simple, made extra soup if you want, and I didn't reply right away. Just stared at the screen with that hollow in my chest that sometimes makes even kindness feel like too much. But an hour later, I showed up anyway, hair unbrushed, hoodie too big, eyes still swollen from sleep I hadn't really gotten, and you didn't say anything about how I looked. Didn't ask questions or tiptoe around my mood. You just opened the door like it was the most natural thing in the world and handed me a bowl that smelled like home. And I sat down on the couch while you put on some quiet music. And we didn't talk for a while, and that silence, it didn't feel like the kind that comes when two people have nothing to say. It felt like the kind that comes when saying nothing is the kindest thing either of us could do. And somewhere in that stillness, with a spoon in my hand and a blanket on my lap and your quiet breathing a few feet away, I felt my entire body unclench, like something inside me had been holding its breath for months and finally remembered how to let go. And I didn't say thank you because it would have felt too small, too thin for what you'd just given me. So I just looked at you and you nodded. Like you'd felt it too, like maybe you'd needed that same kind of softness just as much. And I realized then that maybe we were saving each other without even trying, just by being the place where neither of us had to pretend. And I carried that feeling with me for days, like a secret in my pocket, like armor that no one else could see. And later that week, I found myself doing the same thing for you, texting you out of nowhere, asking if you wanted to come over and do nothing. And when you arrived, I had your favorite snack and a playlist that reminded me of you. And you didn't say it, but I could see in your eyes that you'd needed that just as badly as I had. And that's when I understood what this was, not just friendship, but refuge. Not just listening, but witnessing. Not just showing up, but staying in the moments where most people leave because there's nothing easy to hold on to. And I think we both knew it without needing to speak it, that this was different, that this was rare. That whatever had pulled our lives together had done so with a kind of grace neither of us could name, but both of us could feel. And from that point on, the fear started to quiet, not disappear, but shift, like a storm that still rumbles in the distance but no longer lives directly overhead. And I started to trust that maybe the good things could last. Maybe the people who see you at your worst don't always walk away. And maybe the versions of ourselves we buried years ago were still waiting, still whole, still ready to come home. And as we sat in that room, the soup long gone, the sun slipping beneath the edge of the window, I leaned my head against your shoulder without thinking, without asking, and you didn't move. Didn't speak, just reached up and rested your hand gently against mine. And that was it. That was it. That was everything. That was the moment I knew that even if I never found the right words, you'd keep listening anyway. I didn't realize how much of me you had memorized until the day I tried to hide again. Not in any obvious way. Not with distance or silence or withdrawal, but in the quieter, more practiced ways I'd used my whole life, laughing too hard at things that didn't feel funny, asking too many questions to avoid being asked anything back, wrapping my sadness in convenience so no one would have to carry it but me, and yet Somehow, you saw through all of it. You looked at me from across that cafe table, steam rising between us like a shield I didn't know I was building. And you tilted your head the slightest bit and said, "Is today one of those days?" And I froze, not because I was caught, but because I was known. Because you didn't need me to fall apart loudly to understand I was unraveling slowly. And something about the way you said it, soft, steady, unafraid, made my throat ache, and I nodded without saying a word, and you didn't push. Didn't make me talk or explain or unspool it all just for the sake of your comfort. You just reached across the table and nudged my mug closer, like warmth could be a kind of answer. And in that moment, I think I felt more held than I ever had in my life. Not by your hands, but by your understanding, by your refusal to let me disappear beneath my own disguise. And later, as we walked back through the city side by side, our shadows stretching across the sidewalk, I kept thinking about how rare that was. How rare you were. How people spend their whole lives looking for someone who doesn't flinch at their unspoken edges. And somehow, I found you without even knowing I was looking, and I wanted to tell you all of this. Wanted to stop in the middle of the street and say, "You're the first person who's ever seen all of me and stayed." But I didn't, because the words felt too big in my mouth. So instead I said, "Thanks for today." And you smiled and said, "Always." And we kept walking like nothing had changed, even though everything had. And that night, when I got home, I sat in the dark for a long time, not because I was sad, but because the quiet finally felt safe, finally felt like mine again. And I thought about all the times before when silence meant danger, meant isolation, meant being forgotten, and how now, with you, it meant space, softness, permission. And I didn't cry, not that night, but I felt something in me shift. Something in the way I breathed or blinked or believed in things I hadn't believed in for years, and I realized I was starting to trust not just you, but me, the version of me that was learning how to exist without apology, to speak without shrinking, to feel without fearing the consequences. And you gave me that. Not through grand gestures or poetic affirmations, but through your simple, quiet, unwavering presence. And I think that's the most powerful kind of love there is. The kind that doesn't rescue you from the dark, but sits with you in it. Waits without a clock, listens without conditions, and somehow makes even the heaviness feel a little bit lighter just by being shared. And if I never said it out loud, if I never found the right way to wrap all this into language, I hope you always felt it in the pauses, in the way I stopped hiding from your gaze, in the way I let you see the parts of me that still shook when the world got too loud, because that was me saying, "I trust you." There's a moment in every long story where you realize you're no longer telling it to survive, but because you finally made peace with the fact that it happened. And as I sat beside you in that quiet, golden evening where everything felt like it had slowed down just enough to breathe again, I understood that I was no longer carrying my story like a shield, no longer handing you pieces of my past as proof that I was worth staying for, but instead offering them the way you'd always offered me your presence, with no expectation, no demand, only trust. And it hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, that this entire time I had been waiting for something to end, for the other shoe to drop, for the silence to return with its old sharpness. But it never did, because you never left, not once, not when I disappeared for days, not when I got quiet without warning, not when I contradicted myself or laughed too loudly or folded into myself without explanation. And it turns out that sometimes healing isn't about knowing how to hold yourself together. It's about realizing you were never supposed to do it alone. And I looked at you, really looked, and saw someone who had become more than a friend, more than a safe place, someone who had become a mirror that didn't distort, a light that didn't blind. And I didn't need to say anything dramatic or beautiful or profound, because you already knew the way you always knew. And instead, I reached out and held your hand, not out of need, but out of knowing, and we sat there like that. Skin against skin, heart beside heart, letting the quiet tell its own story. And in that moment, I didn't think about the people who left, or the versions of me I had to shed, or the years I spent trying to be small enough to be loved. I only thought about this moment, this stillness. This miracle of being fully seen and still held. And maybe that's the ending I never saw coming. The one that didn't wrap itself in closure or apology, but simply was. The kind of ending that felt more like a beginning. The kind that said, "You made it through," not because I fought harder than anyone else, but because someone reached across the silence and stayed there, steady, warm, listening to the hurt I never said out loud and turning it slowly, gently into something that no longer had to define me, only remind me of how far I'd come. And when the sun dipped below the horizon and the light shifted from gold to blue, you squeezed my hand once and said, "I'm proud of you," and I didn't look away, didn't downplay it, didn't deflect. I just said, "Thank you," and meant it in 1,000 ways I couldn't name. And later, when we stood to leave, I realized I didn't feel the usual fear that good things don't last. Because I finally understood that some people don't walk into your life to fix you or to save you. They walk in just to sit beside you while you put yourself back together. And they love you through the process, not despite it. And if that's not a kind of miracle, I don't know what is.